If you get more serious with wildlife photography, you will probably end up buying a large super telephoto prime, and the most common lenses here are 400mm 2.8 or a 600mm f4 lens. And I get often asked, which one should I choose? Do you have any recommendations? And it's not an easy recommendation, and in fact I was facing myself with the same question around a year ago, and ultimately I decided to go with the 600mm f4 lens. And in this video I want to discuss a bit the advantages and disadvantages of each lens, want to compare them more in detail. In front of me I have the Canon RF 400mm 2.8 LIS lens and the RF 600mm f4 LIS lens, so the newest generation of the super telephoto lenses for the RF mount. And I was doing some direct comparison between the two lenses. I was shooting both of them. The last days I was shooting more with the 400mm 2.8, and I did some tests in terms of maximum magnification, background blur and bokeh, and also sharpness tests, also with the extenders. The sharpness tests and some other things are of course specific to these two models, but many of the things that I want to talk about, many of these considerations, they apply also if you shoot with Sony or with Nikon, because their 400mm 2.8 and 600mm f4 are quite similar in this matter. So what you will notice immediately when you look at these two lenses is that the RF 400mm 2.8 is much shorter than the RF 600mm f4. This here is around 37 centimeters. Here we have 47 centimeters without the lens hood. So that's a 10 centimeter difference, and that makes a huge difference in your backpack. For example, I have only two big backpacks where I can manage to fit the RF 600mm f4 with an attached camera into the backpack, and in one of them it's still very tight. The 400mm f2.8 on the other hand, I can fit more easily in many backpacks with the camera attached, and sometimes even with tele extenders attached. In terms of diameter they are very comparable, so here we are at 16 centimeters, here at 17. What you notice when you lift these two lenses up is that there is a difference in weight. So the 400mm lens is a bit lighter. This one weighs 2,890 grams. Here we are at 3,090 grams. So pretty much a 200 gram difference. And what you also notice is that the weight distribution is a bit different. So here the main weight, the center of gravity, is quite far behind, so close to the camera, whereas on the 600mm f4, if I take this into my hand, it feels more in front. It feels more like here instead of closer to the camera with the 400mm 2.8. And if you shoot handheld, this does make a considerable difference. The 400mm 2.8 seems much lighter. It seems like a bigger difference than 200 grams if you hold it and shoot. If you just take them in the hand like this, the difference is not so big. But once you're starting to take pictures, this feels lighter, and it also makes it easier to make fast movements and track fast flying birds such as swifts or swallows. These specifications are again for the RF versions of this lens, but for Sony and Nikon there is a similar trend, meaning the 400mm 2.8 is roughly 200 grams lighter than the 600mm f4, and you can also see a difference in the size of the lens. Another important difference is the minimum focus distance. So on the 400 2.8 we can focus up to 2.5 meters. On the 600 f4 it's 4.2 meters. And that's a really big difference. When does this matter? Well, if you sometimes like to take close-ups of flowers, reptiles, amphibians, very, let's say, tame birds or birds at a feeder where you can really get up close and they're maybe rather small. For me this was when I was taking hummingbirds in Costa Rica. I sometimes struggled because with the 600mm f4 I was too close to the bird. And to get it bigger in the frame, I actually needed to take an extender and take a step back. So there the 400mm 2.8 would have been better. I actually ended up using my RF 100-500 a bit more because I could get a bigger magnification than with the 600mm f4. However, this is only important if you can get close enough to your subject, obviously, which is in wildlife photography not always the case. More about that later. And what also results of this very short minimum focus distance of 2.5 meters is that the 400mm 2.8 actually has a bigger magnification, maximum magnification than the 600mm f4. So for the 400mm f2.8 we have a maximum magnification of 0.17. 600mm f4 is at 0.15. That doesn't sound like a big difference, and in my opinion it also isn't a big difference. I took some test shots of this small metal squirrel and you can see, yes, the 400mm 2.8 shows it a bit bigger, but the difference is really not that big. So I think the minimum focus distance will be much more important than the maximum magnification that you can get with each lens. Otherwise, the lenses share basically all of the controls and the technology, and again, the same if you shoot Nikon or Sony. They share things like the effectiveness of the stabilizer. Usually they have the same buttons and dials that you can program. These two have a 52mm filter thread that you can, or a screw-in filter that you can use, for example, for polarizer filter or ND filter, which I have never used, but this is also the same for these two lenses. And last but not least, the price. This one is around $12,000 US. The RF 600mm is around $13,000 US. So 1,000 difference. Personally, I think that's not really relevant anymore at this point. Of course, $1,000 US is quite some money, but if you already spent 12,000, if you spend 1,000 more, if it's more useful for you, I think this should not stop you from buying the 600mm f4. For Sony and Nikon, it's similar. The 600mm f4 is also more expensive. In terms of autofocus, I can just say that both of these lenses focus very fast and very reliable. I have not enough experience yet to make a direct comparison and say that one is better in these situations or that one better in this. They seem very similar to me. That's my first impression. I had the feeling that if you shoot without extender, the 400mm 2.8 has a slight edge, but once you start adding the extender to match the focal length, they seem to be very comparable. Both of these lenses also offer a very good image stabilizer. Canon is rating it at 5.5 stops, and this is of course useful if it starts to get dark, for example in the forest, or also when you need to have a bit more special shooting situation and you need to shoot over the display and you are not so stable anymore. So many people ask me if they would just buy the 400mm 2.8 and use the 1.4 extender. They get 560mm f4, which is very close to 600mm f4, but you kind of remain more flexible and you have a kind of shorter combination. Obviously, you would assume that there is a bit of degradation in image quality, and again, you have a bit less focal length. So I wanted to test with these two lenses, the RF 400mm 2.8 and the RF 600mm f4, how big the difference really is. And I took a test picture always in the middle of the image and at the edge of the image, and all the pictures are taken with the maximum aperture. So if we have a first look here, both lenses without extender, we obviously see that the 600mm f4 has a much tighter framing than the 400-8. This is clear. If we zoom in, we also see that both of them are very sharp in the center and also in the edge of the frame. Honestly, this was also to be expected with lenses of this price point. So I think a bit more interesting is if we are in a situation where we need more focal length than 400mm, we need around 600. And we put the 1.4 extender into the 400mm 2.8, how does it stack up against the 600mm f4? So if we look at the overall scene, the first thing you can see is that 600mm f4 is indeed a bit tighter than 560mm f4 that we get with the 400 and the 1.4 extender. It's noticeable, but not a dramatic difference. If we zoom in the center of the image, we can now see that the 600mm f4 clearly resolves more details. Again, I would say it's not a dramatic difference, but it's noticeable. If we move to the edge of the frame, this difference gets actually less clear in my opinion. It's still there, but I'm really doubting that we would see the difference here in the real world. If we go one step further and we need more focal length, so we use the 1.4 extender for the 600mm f4, resulting in 840mm f5.6, and we use the 2x extender on the 400, resulting in 800mm f5.6. And we zoom in again, we can see that now the difference is bigger. The 600mm f4 with the 1.4 extender is still very sharp. I basically see almost no difference to the image before, and the image of the 400mm 2.8 with the 2x extender seems to get a bit softer. And once again, if we move to the edge of the frame, I feel like the differences are actually a bit smaller, which was not really what I was expecting. Finally, if we need even more focal length, we can also use a 2x extender on the 600mm f4, which gives us 1200mm f8. Obviously, this will not work in all situations very well, because you need to consider some things like heat haze that you could have if you shoot on a long distance. You could have some mist or fog in between you and your subject, so it would probably not work well with deer, moose or other large animals, or just when you shoot on a long distance. But if you have a hummingbird or just a small bird that is maybe just 10 meters away, but it's really very small and you need this focal length, then it can be very useful. And I actually used the 2x extender in some situation on the 600mm f4. And with the 400mm 2.8, we're kind of stuck at this 800mm. More is not possible because we cannot stack extenders. So the only option we have is digitally zoom in a bit more. I did do just that to again match the framing. And I feel like here we see obviously the clearest difference. The 600mm f4 with the 2x extender is definitely still usable. It loses a bit of sharpness, but it's still doing very good. And the 400mm 2.8 with the 2x extender and the digital zoom, we really see a loss of detail and also a bit of loss of contrast. And we have again the same if we move to the edge of the frame, but the difference is a bit smaller, but still definitely noticeable. Now, these were some, let's call them studio tests for this sake. How does it look like if you just go out, take pictures of birds? Did I feel a difference there if I just looked at the back of my screen or afterwards at the computer? First of all, of course, if I use both lenses without an extender, they're razor sharp, nothing to complain. If I use the 400mm 2.8 with the 1.4 extender, is it less sharp than the 600mm f4? Yes, maybe, but it's ever so slightly that I don't think it's so important. However, once we need more focal length, I feel like the 600mm f4 with 1.4 extender is noticeably sharper than the 400mm 2.8 with the 2x. I felt the 400mm with a 2x extender, yeah, it works. It can give great results in some situations, but overall I really saw a loss of sharpness compared to what I was used for my 600mm f4. So that was definitely noticeable for me in the field, but again, it can still work, and I think it's still worth to put the extender if you know that you need a bit more focal length. So what are my conclusions and recommendations? Who should buy the 400-8 and who should buy the 600mm f4? So if you are taking pictures of subjects where you can get reasonably close, maybe because the animals are either very big or you can just approach them closely. If you are taking pictures of flowers, amphibians, very small birds, if you need to get close because maybe you shoot a lot on your balcony where you have a feeder and the balcony is only 3.5 meters long, these are all situations where I would clearly take the 400mm 2.8. Also, if you shoot in dark conditions and you can get close enough, the 400mm 2.8 has an advantage. If the animals are too far away and you end up using the extender, then it basically loses its advantage that it has. If you are able to approach the animals close enough, you can also get a nicer bokeh, like these bokeh balls, if you have some water drops or something in the background. So they are a bit bigger with the 400-8, so that's another advantage. And in general, I would say if you like to shoot pictures with the animal rather small in the image, this is another reason why I would obviously go rather for the 400mm 2.8. On the other hand, if you take a lot of pictures of shy, small birds, songbirds for example, you walk maybe in a nature reserve where you need to stay in the path and cannot go closer to your subjects, maybe you photograph dangerous animals. I would rather go for a 600mm f4, because if you use it with the extender, you have a bit better image quality and you can go up to 1200mm, at least if there is not like too much heat haze going on. Another advantage of the 600mm f4 is that if you have a not ideal perspective, not an ideal shooting position, the 600mm looks better than the 400mm, or shooting on a longer distance can have an advantage. Let me give you a clear example. If I'm on a safari and I'm in the Jeep, ideally I would be on eye level, but depending on the safari and on the situation, you cannot exit the Jeep, so you need to shoot from the vehicle. And if you have a bit of higher position and the animal is farther away, you have like a flatter angle. So that's also a situation where I would prefer the 600mm f4. So I hope I could help you a bit with the decision which lens of these is the right one for you. I think if you're in the market for one of them, neither one will be a completely wrong decision. You will always have the situations where you wish you had the other one. That's normal. Just pick the one you think you will need most. Think maybe also a bit about what you have as a smaller lens. I also sometimes like to include a bit more of the surroundings, or if the animal is really getting closer, I need less focal length. And I think the 400mm 2.8 pairs very well with the 70 to 200mm f2.8. Whereas for the 600mm, I always felt that my 70 to 200mm, well, there was too much of a gap between 200 and 600mm. So I ended up using either the 100 to 500 or more recently the 100 to 300, at least if I don't need to hike too much. So that's something to consider. And most of the people that buy such a lens, they already have a zoom lens, such as a 200 to 800, 150 to 600, or 100 to 500. If you have one of these lenses, just look at your pictures that you have taken with this lens and look at which focal length you have basically taken most images, or the images you like most. And I think this should give you a quite good idea which of these two is right for you.